All right, we got one more guest, one more segment here for this Tuesday edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is professional handicapper Ralph Michaels from wagertalk.com. Ralph, how's it going today, man?
Going great. A week away from college football. Can't be more excited.
Yeah.
A week away. How about college basketball, I should say? There's always college football a week away, but a week away from college basketball is what I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. And, it's one of those things where it's nice to get a new season. It's nice to have an opportunity to maybe get into a market that's not as efficient as college football is right now.
Agree. 353 teams, the Vegas bookmakers, are going to do their diligence. But again, it's difficult to post numbers on those. And unlike college football, where lines have been out since the summer and you could find a multitude of power ratings, they're not out there in college basketball. With 353 teams, there's very few people that have had numbers on all those teams. And again, in college basketball, that's why you find value early. You have multiple games in a week, 353 teams, a lot of weird matchups with the tournaments and the non-conference schedules. So it really is just being in a position to cherry pick the best of the best where there's a discrepancy in the lines.
Well, of course, you've been hard at work on college basketball. College basketball really is your sport. You excel at it. You do a very, very good job of it. What have you been looking at here of late in terms of getting ready for the season here, which, as you mentioned, next Tuesday already?
Yeah, next Tuesday with 146 games, I believe. So, talking about some of the new rule changes, there's only 2 new rule changes this year. The first, I don't think there's going to be much of a difference in the way the game is played, and that is that the shot clock gets reset to 20 seconds after an offensive rebound. So the only time that comes into effect is late in the game, and, most of the time that's in foul situations. So I do like that rule. The second is I think, significant. The three-point line getting moved back from 20 feet 9 inches to 22 feet 1 3/4 inches. And that's a 6.7% difference. And, the percent may not seem huge at 7%, but these kids have grown up the last few years playing an offense in the system they're comfortable with, being in the spots on the court that they like to shoot. So I think there will be a significant change. In the NIT, it was too small of a sample size in last year's NIT tournament when they tested it. But you have some teams, and I went back and pulled off the teams that have shot the most three-pointers. Savannah State shot 39 three-pointers per game. Citadel 34.5, Winthrop 32, and then Auburn and Villanova shot 30 three-pointers per game. So those are the 5 teams that you automatically look at. And then you have Buffalo, Elon, Marshall, Youngstown State, Akron, and Presbyterian, Fresno State. Those teams all shot 28 or more. So you're talking a significant amount of the offense. When you look at percentage-wise, Lehigh led the country at 42% from three-pointers. Wofford was 41. South Dakota State was 41. Obviously, we know, Wofford and South Dakota State both lost stars, so those percentages are going to go down. So you have to look if a team is going to lose a percent or two on their shooting, if they're going to try a few less three-pointers, we're going to see how much that affects the teams that shoot a lot, and then how much it affects the total. So you can guesstimate what you think is going to happen early, but, until we see it play out 3-4 weeks into it, then we'll have to see if we could beat the adjustments that Vegas is going to need to make, and if the public's even going to be aware of those adjustments early by checking, the scoring after multiple days or multiple weeks.
Well, and as I look at Bart Torvik here from last year, looking at the share of threes coming from those offensive possessions, some big-name teams out there. Villanova was 3rd in the country. They took a ton of three-pointers last year. Auburn took a lot. A team like North Dakota State out of the Summit League, Siena, Fresno State, Furman, Creighton. A lot of teams out there. Utah took a lot of threes. Davidson, of course, as we know, a jump shooting team. So you got a lot of teams here that are going to be affected by this, and some of the bad defense is probably going to get a little bit better, as you mentioned. But also, one of the other elements I saw, and I was kind of reading up on this morning, is that one of the reasons that they decided to make this rule is that it would make the lane a little bit more accessible for some of those guards that like to get to the rack. So some of the teams that have bad perimeter defenses, we may think that this will help them because of their three-point shooting defense, but also if their guards just don't defend well, the opposition's going to get a lot of clean looks at the rim too. So, again, a lot of schematic things come into play with a rule change like this.
It does. And, what I think is that, the more athletic guys are clearly going to have an advantage. You see a team, last year, I believe Houston led the country in three-point defense. It was Houston, VCU, Murray State, Virginia, Oregon, Michigan. Well, right there, that shows you those are all damn good teams. So if you're going to look at a stat, I mean, that's a stat that you have to look at to show what good teams are. Well, why are those good teams good? Well, number one, they play interior defense, and number two, they have athletic guards to be able to get out and guard the three-pointers. So, I think we're going to see a little bit of a separation where, this helps the more athletic teams because they can get out and cover the deeper three-pointers, where the guys that pack in the zone, now we'll have to see. Do they extend the zone? Does that leave the backdoor cuts wide open? So, you look at it and you say, well, it's only, a foot and couple inches, but, you spread that field you spread that court an extra 7%, and schematically it's going to change a lot.
Yeah, for sure. You think about teams like Virginia Tech, Syracuse, a team like Georgia State that made it out of the Sun Belt, they tended to play very good interior defense. Oregon, same thing. So like you said, having to stretch that zone out a little bit, does that open some more of the mid-range game for some of these teams, a little more pick and roll? It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. And I'm also curious to see how it will play out, not just from an X's and O's standpoint, but from the standpoint of how totals are listed. These teams that are very reliant on the long-distance jump shots, will we see their totals maybe held down a point or two, 3 points, something like that, until we start to see some data on this? Similarly, those teams that, maybe aren't very good on offense, take a lot of threes, what happens with their totals? I think that's going to be really intriguing to find out.
Yeah, looking on the Wager Talk college basketball cheat sheet I'm looking at, there were 24 teams that averaged over 38% last year. And, we've seen the carryover in the NBA, and that's why, you have some of these upsets you do. Well, if you could shoot 40% from the three-point line, that's like shooting 60% from mid-range, 2-point shots. And to me, I think we're going to see a drop in scoring. If I can make a guess, I'm gonna say that 6% number that they're moving, the 6% that they're moving back, we're not going to see a 6% difference because, again, it may open up a few more things. But I expect scoring to be down 3 or 4%. So, we'll see if my numbers are right based on the last few years of what the team's averaged and what the adjustments are. The other thing you can't look at is you can't tend to overreact to some early non-conference games. We know that if you're looking at scoring for the entire season, well, when you get into these Big Ten battles, you're not going to have the same high-scoring games as you are in some of your non-conference games. So what you need to compare, if you are looking at these early numbers, go back and look to see what the scoring was in November only for the last few years, and then compare it to the November-only stats for this year.
Something else I wanted to ask you about here. We talked a lot about returning production when it came to college football, and I presume that's a lot of what people are looking at here in college basketball right now in terms of returning starters, things of that sort, because, look, guard play is just critically important in college basketball. You've got to be able to take care of the basketball. You've got to be able to salt those games away where you have a late lead. So I imagine that's been a pretty important hallmark of your preseason prep. So who are some of the teams that you think, could struggle at the outset because they don't have a lot of experience or returning production against some of those teams that do?
Well, let's just mention there's a handful of teams that return 0 starters. And, some are bad teams and some aren't normally line teams. I mean, Chicago State was probably the 350 50th or 51st team, one of the worst teams in basketball last year playing in the WAC, and they have no returning starters. So you're going to have a new level of ineptness in Chicago State. But the guys that return no starters are Chicago State, Hartford, Memphis, Mississippi Valley State, Nebraska, Nevada, Norfolk State, and Tennessee. Now, Memphis, which had the number one recruiting class, is going to be a team like Duke that had no returning starters, and they're still picked as the top 20 team. But outside of Memphis, you're really going to see those teams struggle quite a bit. On the flip side, there's 22 teams that return all 5 starters, or at least 5 guys that were a majority of starters in the team. And I'm just going to run them down. And one thing I want to mention to people is 5 starters doesn't necessitate an automatic play when you see these guys lining up. We've seen in college football this past year, the teams with the most returning starters in college football ended up going, I think, 3-14 against the spread the first 2 weeks. So if you have 5 guys that started and you were a team that won 5 games and you were outscored by 18 points per game, those same 5 starters, they're going to be better, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be an elite team or even an upper level team. So the 22 college teams out of the 353 teams this year that return all 5 starters: Air Force, Albany, Colorado, Dartmouth and Davidson, East Tennessee State, Eastern Illinois, Lafayette, Long Island, Loyola of Maryland, Manhattan, Mount St. Mary's, North Dakota State, Northern Arizona, Notre Dame, Oklahoma State, Providence, Rhode Island, Richmond, USF, Texas Arlington, and Towson. So just something to keep an eye on. At a glance, I'll have all this on the Wager Talk cheat sheet. I keep adding things, so I keep delaying it, but it will be out by at least Thursday on my page at Wager Talk, which you'll be able to get a quick reference guide for every team and every conference in college basketball.
Well, make sure you follow at CalSportsLV on Twitter as well, where you can find all that information throughout the week from Ralph Michaels. Ralph, let's transition over to college football for a few minutes here, as we've got a lot of games, a lot of interesting games here this week in Week 10. Let's start with BYU and Utah State here. I think this one's interesting because Utah State is playing in a very, very quick tempo, but they are nowhere near as efficient as last season. BYU coming off a little bit of extra rest here. This line's down from 5 to 3.5 very early in the week.
Yeah, I bet it at 5.5, actually, one of the early numbers at the Circa. So I am on BYU. You look at the schedule difference, and BYU has played the number 7 schedule. So when you say, well, they're getting outgained by 25 yards per game, that's really not bad. Utah State's getting outgained by over 10 yards per game against the number 57 schedule. This is where BYU has an edge. That number 7 schedule from the Cougars is because they're an independent. Well, you have trouble scheduling people. So anyone that you're going to play Power 5 opponents, you're going to have to play in their traditional non-conference roles the first 5 weeks. And what did BYU face early? Utah, Tennessee, USC, Washington. A brutal stretch. Now, look what they had. They're off the upset against Boise. They're rested in a bye. They have Utah State, Liberty, Idaho State, UMass, and San Diego State. It's a schedule set up for success. You're sitting at 3-4 with the upset of Boise, the upset of USC, and the upset of Tennessee. You're off a bye. You're playing your in-state rival with double revenge. And on the flip side, you have a Utah State team, which, of course, is in the middle of their conference play. They were off a very difficult game against Air Force where they were embarrassed. 128 yards, 7 first downs last week traveling to Air Force. So their schedule at LSU, home against Nevada, go to Air Force. You have this BYU game, and then you have to go to Fresno and Wyoming, 2 very physical teams. So I do like the spot for BYU. They're 10-2. Their last 12 is an away dog, and I think they get the job done with an outright upset.
Yeah, I like that too. I agree with the line move coming down here on this game. In fact, I actually saw this one post offshore. BetOnline had 8 for a very, very short time. Then it went to 6. Then we saw most of the market reopen this one back at 5. So I agree. Great grab by you there on the 5.5, and hopefully that one plays out in your favor. We'll move down a couple of spots here. Game 343, 344 by rotation number is Oregon and USC. Oregon's a 4.5-point road favorite here, but interestingly enough, Pinnacle, the sharpest of the offshore markets, the first one to drop this number down to 4.
Again, Adam, this is my number 2 game that I already played. So it's not as if though we spoke. You just happened to pick 2 games that I really did like. And I am on the USC Trojans. You know, you're talking about a team that had to play 3 quarterbacks. And, you know, you're talking about Matt Fink had to go to BYU his first road start, they lose. Slovis had to go to Washington, first road start, they lose. Then they go to Notre Dame, and what happened? You saw them grow up on the road and learn how to play well. They ended up at Notre Dame only getting outgained by 47 yards. First downs were even. They come home against Arizona where they're playing well, 41-14. The offense starts clicking, 5.6 yards per carry. Again, this may be a run-and-shoot offense, but they do use their running backs. It's not the traditional full Washington State run-and-shoot with Graham Harrell as the OC. The Colorado comeback, again, impressed me. 30 first downs on the road tells me that this offense is doing what you expect. 3 NFL receivers with Pittman, Vaughns, and St. Brown. You know, at home, they're a huge home-road dichotomy for USC. And I look at Oregon. You know, the Oregon put up great numbers early in the year, but we're seeing that those numbers were fairly fake. You know, Auburn with a freshman making his first start in a dome situation. Nevada, no offense. Montana, no offense. Stanford, no offense with no quarterback. Cal, one of the worst offenses in Power 5. Colorado had a lot of guys banged up. Washington, we saw them get exposed. 31 points, 414 yards. Washington State, the exact same offense they're seeing now. 446 yards. They allowed 406 yards passing. That was at home in a setting where they were excited. Now that same defense has to go on the road and play a better passing team with 3 better receivers. And then if you watch that Oregon game, you know, they're off a comeback win against Washington, which impressed the hell out of me. But then what happens in last week's game? They fall behind against Washington State. They come back. They win that game on a late drive. And the players rush the field like they were an underdog and they won their conference. They were a double-digit favorite at home, and you rushed the field. That's 2 emotional games in a row against Washington and Washington State. Now having to travel to USC, I believe the Trojans win the game.
Yeah, I like the Trojans to win the game here too. And also that Oregon pass defense. Washington really shredded them, and Washington has not shredded too many teams through the air. Jacob Easton, I don't think he's been what everybody expected there in Seattle. And then, of course, Washington State shreds a lot of teams, but you know they threw for 4 bills on Oregon. So I guess it's set up really, really nicely for USC. I agree with the points. I agree with the outright stance. I think USC is a good-looking play here this week. How about this game? And we jump a couple spots down the board again, 347, 348. It's been a long time since the Sunflower Showdown between Kansas State and Kansas had this much intrigue. But damn, if this isn't one of the best games of the weekend here.
Yeah, isn't it fun? And I'm happy. You know what? I never want to see a team like Kansas be down for as long as they were. You know, I'm not a huge Les Miles fan, but, you know, it's a new attitude there. So I enjoy it. I really don't like, you know, these teams on the bottom. You know, I have 2 teams that are like 37 in my power ratings with Akron and UMass. That's just crazy low. So, you know, college football is better when we have teams that are at least competitive and not as ugly as they get. You know, in Kansas State, you have a team that is much like a Bill Snyder team. You know, they're going to get outgained in a lot of games. They don't turn the ball over. They run the ball okay. They play very good red zone defense, and they have very good special teams, and that's exactly what you have with K-State. Now, let's remember, you know, you're bringing in a winning mentality. You may think, well, Snyder's gone and Chris Kleiman is there. Chris Kleiman has won 79% of every game he's coached at North Dakota State. He coached a D3 team and now here. So with him and with his assistants, you have a winning mentality with players buying into the system. And, you know, you look, they got outgained by 100 yards against TCU, won the game. Why? Red zone defense and no turnovers. Oklahoma, you got outgained by 71 yards. What happened? You rushed for 213. You won the rushing battle, and you were plus 2 turnovers. Same thing at Mississippi State. They got outgained by 83 yards per game. So there's times where you look at that and you say, well, hell, their last 3 wins, Oklahoma, TCU, and Mississippi State, they were outgained by a total of 254 yards, yet they won those. I want to fade that team. But there's just teams that tend to play differently, and I think that's one of them. The thing about Kansas that you have to look at is Les Miles wants to play slow. We know that. He is traditionally one of the slowest paced head coaches, and that's the way they played early. Yes, they had 72 plays against Boston College in that upset because they were just playing at a little faster tempo. But that's the same team against West Virginia that only ran 56 plays. Well, when an OC gets fired, when a Washington State DC gets fired because they allowed 100 points to UCLA, you know about it. But Kansas made the change to Brett Derriman at OC the last couple weeks, and he has completely changed this offense. They ran 86 plays at Texas, and they ran over 70 plays against Texas Tech. They are now an up-tempo offense that had 569 and 527 yards the last 2 games against Texas and Texas Tech. The defense is still giving up a lot of points. They've allowed, they're allowing 474 yards and over 26 first downs per game. So you have a very fast offense on Kansas. You have a very slow offense on Kansas State. 2 competing styles. I've gone back and forth in this game. You have K-State excited. They're back in the top 25 and off an upset. And I just tweeted this out, Adam, and I have to jump to Twitter to look what the exact record was. And it surprised me when teams pull the upset as a 20-point dog like Kansas State did against Oklahoma, and they're an away favorite the next week. It's only happened 9 times since 2007, so the last 13 years. But that team is 8-1 straight up, 7-2 against the spread. The last time it occurred was Iowa against Illinois back in 2016. So, you do have the better team. This used to be an automatic for me. Boy, I can tell you, Bill Snyder on Kansas, it didn't matter. He would pound them. He would pound them. He would pound them. He would win and cover. A different dynamic with 2 new head coaches. I lean with the dog a little bit, but this one, 2 strong opinions on those first 2 games, and I'm going to be wishy-washy here and just say I lean with the dog and I lean with the over.
I mean, it's incredible what Kansas is doing offensively this year. They are 33rd in the country in yards per play with 6.33. They were 107th in the country in yards per play last year. So Les Miles doing work. You mentioned that offensive coordinator change having a big impact here. And also, too, 6.4 yards per play in conference games for Kansas. Pretty damn impressive. But, man, from a spot standpoint, this game is such an intriguing handicap. And I agree with you. I think it's very hard to take either side here. Line has moved down from 6.5 to as low as 5. So sharp money on Kansas here early in the week. Maybe you're looking to fade Kansas State off the big win. But also for Kansas here, I don't know how many people saw the way in which they beat Texas Tech last week. It was one of the craziest endings I've ever seen. Field goal gets blocked. Texas Tech tries to recover and return it. They try a lateral. Guy throws the lateral to nobody. Kansas lineman falls on it. They get another crack at the field goal and kick the game winner. And that's a week after they took Texas to the ropes in a 50-48 game. So I think both of these teams are in really challenging spots. Kansas hasn't won this rivalry game since 2009, though. So I guess I favor them. I would take them at the 5.5, but I'm just happy that this game has storylines to talk about, man. It's awesome for Kansas and for these 2 programs.
It is, and I think the sharp moves, that you talked about is really more because, the Twitter feedback I got when I put out that record was like, holy hell, I would have guessed the exact opposite. But again, you're only talking 8 games in 13 years. So there can be so many anomalies in there that it's nothing that you can really say. But, when I looked at teams that just I'm looking right now, if you just said every team that pulled an upset as a 20-point favorite, and it's starting to pull up the numbers, that is still about 50%, where I would have thought it's a negative. But again, college football is a little bit different than the NFL, where, in the NFL with teams with parity, you look at them to return to the median. Back since 2000, boy, it's 50.5%. So teams since 2007, looking back at the last 13 years, teams that are often upset as a 20-plus point dog have gone 50.5% against the spread. So that just tells you one thing. Yes, it may affect them. Historically, there's enough times that it's happened where it hasn't been a difference against the spread one way or the other. So while you're adding it to your handicapping, don't over-adjust because of it.
One other college game I actually want to touch on with you here, and we'll just bypass the NFL with you for this week. We'll make up those games on a different segment with somebody else. But game 359-360 here, SMU in Memphis. This line all of a sudden is a runaway train with Memphis up to a 6-point favorite. I thought 3 and 3.5 were a little bit light, but now that this has gone up to 6, I mean, that's some significant money in a very high-profile game.
All right. I am looking now. Do you have a game number, Adam?
359-360.
359-360. My power rating was pick in the game. We weren't planning on talking about it, so sorry, guys, I didn't know that. But so obviously, I'm leaning the SMU side. Now, I will say this, in last week's game, I almost played against SMU. You are talking about immense pressure. You have a team that before last week, I thought I would like him at Houston. When Boise State lost to BYU, that all of a sudden made SMU the number one group of 5 team. So you have every kid on SMU going, if we win this game and this game and this game, we are going to a New Year's Six bowl, guys. This is amazing. And what happened last week? We saw them struggle. They got outgained by 171 yards off the top of my head at Houston. They did not play well. It was not the same offense. And now you're going to face a Memphis team that's getting ESPN Game Day. And, while some of the luster has come off ESPN Game Day and it may not be as exciting, and they had to go to an FCS game to draw a fever pitch last week, you're going to Memphis. It's going to be a fever pitch. You're going to get an extra 10,000 people into town to be at that game, to be at that setting. So, I think that adds quite a bit to the home field edge of Memphis. I would probably adjust my number by 1.5 or 2 points because of that. Because you look at the Liberty Bowl. I don't even know if it's still called the Liberty Bowl, but how many empty seats do you see? And there's never people in those end sections, and it's always just a sad setting to watch football. Well, I can tell you now, there's going to be excitement. There's going to be a student section. It's going to be quite different. So I still look at SMU, and I still think they have the better talent. I'm pulling up my stat compare sheet. I have SMU having played the number 86 schedule, and they're plus 117 yards per game, which is number 25 in the country. Memphis has played the number 97 schedule, so 11 spots weaker, and they're number 30 at plus 95 points per game. But if you look at only that stat, you're going to say, well, SMU has played the tougher schedule and FSU is better at yards per game. But let's move over to yards per play. SMU is only plus 0.8 yards per play, number 37. Memphis, one of the most impressive stats out there, they're number 12 in the country at plus 2.1 yards per game. Why? SMU is number 2 in the country in plays per game with 83.8. Memphis, a bottom 10, one of the slowest tempo teams at 65.3 plays per game. So you have a 18.4 play per game difference. That's going to skew any stat you have. So who's going to be able to control the tempo? If SMU gets out early and they get the early lead and Memphis has to speed up the tempo, advantage Mustangs. If Memphis can control the tempo, run the ball, do their short passing game, control the clock, slow down the game, that's going to affect SMU not being on the field as much and not being able to play at the pace they're accustomed to.
One more thought to leave everybody with here, and then we'll wrap up this segment on this show. And I know that this is something that you've talked about a lot. I know you talk about this a lot in college basketball with teams trying to get to 20 or 25 wins, something like that. By my count, we've got 24 teams in college football right now that have 5 wins on the season. So, of course, a 6th win would mean bowl eligibility. We've got some very bad teams here that are looking to pick up a 7th loss here this week. But I know that's an angle that you'll kind of have your eye on here as we go throughout November. Those teams that either get to bowl eligibility or get to a point where a bowl game is just not going to happen.
Adam, I have been harping that not all losses are created equal, and I appreciate you bringing it up. When you are going through your August workouts and you're practicing and you are just putting your heart and soul into preparing for the season, not everyone has goals to win the national championship. Not everyone has goals to get to the playoffs. Not everyone even has goals to win their conference. But I would say 99% of the teams have a goal to get to a bowl. So if you are off a loss and it's your 7th loss, you cannot reach your goal of a winning record. You cannot reach your goal of being 500 or better. You can no longer go to a bowl. It's oftentimes coaches get fired. It's oftentimes that the team switches its game plan and starts going to young, inexperienced players to prepare for next year. I have 2 systems to fit into that mold. If you play on a home dog of 8 or more that's off their 8th loss, off their 7th loss, so they lost their last game and they now have 7 losses, playing against them, you've gone 29-13, 69%. Last week, there was 1 play. It was Rice. This week, there is 1 play. It's UMass. Likewise, if you play against an away dog of 10 or more, that's off their 7th loss. 48-31-2, 62%. Last week, it went 2-0. New Mexico State and Akron. This week, there's 1 team, Old Dominion. So it's that simple. You're playing on your 7th loss, and you're playing a much better opponent because you're either a home dog of 8 or more, or you're a double-digit away dog. You're playing a superior foe that's likely to have a winning record because of the line, and those teams fade down the stretch. So it's, I'm not going to say it's an automatic play on for me, but it's certainly a team that I put right over in the mix and then really have to talk myself out of it to not play against these teams. That's how strong I feel that is.
Well, we'll have to try to keep track of that here as we go throughout the month of November with Rolf Michaels, professional handicapper over at wagertalk.com. What's going on over there at the website right now, Rolf?
Well, again, college basketball around the corner. I'm like a kid in a candy store doing a guide. I want to put this in there. I want to put this in there. I want to put this in there. Well, I'm finally running out of time where I just got to get the damn guide up. So, like I said, it'll be up either tomorrow or Thursday. So make sure you check it out. You're going to have, again, a 1-page guide that's going to be able to give you last year's strength of schedule, last year's final power ratings, their stats with points per game and rebounds per game, their 247 ranking for last year, their 247 ranking for this year. Because in college basketball, that ranking is as important as any. I'm going to have Torvik's numbers in there and Ken Palm's numbers in there. And again, at one glance, you're going to be able to at least know the expectations of that team moving forward. So when you're looking at those 145 lines next Tuesday, you're going to have an idea if that line is right or wrong.
Well, make sure you follow Rolf on Twitter, as I mentioned, at CalSportsLV, and check out his work over at wagertalk.com. Rolf, we appreciate your time as always, buddy. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you again next week.
Can't wait. Next week, college hoops next Tuesday.